What if the strongest version of you was not born despite your family, but because of it? This is not the kind of idea most people are comfortable with, because it forces a shift in how you interpret pain, especially the kind that comes from the very place that was supposed to provide safety. When someone grows up in a toxic environment where emotional instability, neglect, or psychological tension are present, the natural assumption is that this only creates damage, limitation, and long-term suffering. And while that is partially true, it is not the full picture. According to Carl Jung, the psyche does not simply break under pressure. It adapts, reorganizes, and in many cases, develops layers of awareness that would never emerge under comfortable conditions. This does not mean that trauma is something positive in itself, but it does suggest that the way the mind responds to it can lead to unexpected forms of depth, perception, and inner strength. What makes this so difficult to recognize is that this transformation does not happen on the surface. From the outside, it may look like confusion, sensitivity, or even instability, but internally, something much more complex is forming. A child in a toxic environment learns to read emotional patterns before they are spoken, becomes aware of tension before it escalates, and develops a kind of psychological alertness that goes far beyond what is typical. This is where the first misunderstanding begins, because what appears as hypervigilance or emotional intensity is often the early structure of a deeper awareness being formed. It is not strength in the traditional sense, not confidence or control, but a raw, unrefined sensitivity to reality that, over time, can evolve into something far more powerful. The unsettling truth is that not everyone who experiences this kind of environment develops strength, because the same conditions that can create awareness can also create fragmentation.
And this is where the real question begins to emerge. Not whether trauma exists, but what it becomes within you. Because in some cases, it becomes a prison. And in others, it becomes the beginning of something far more profound. Before a person even understands what is happening to them, something has already been formed deep within their psyche, something that does not come from conscious thought, but from repeated emotional exposure that slowly builds an internal structure they will carry into adulthood without realizing it. A child doesn't need to understand toxicity to be shaped by it, because the mind absorbs patterns long before it develops the ability to question them. Tone of voice, emotional inconsistency, unpredictability, subtle rejection, or even the absence of emotional safety begin to organize the way that child perceives love, connection, and self-worth. And because this happens so early, it doesn't feel like something external. It feels like reality itself. According to Carl Jung, much of what defines us operates within the unconscious, meaning that these early experiences do not disappear. They become internalized as psychological frameworks that influence perception, behavior, and emotional reactions later in life. This is what makes the wound invisible, because it is not experienced as a memory, but as a lens through which everything else is interpreted. This is why someone who grows up in a toxic environment may struggle to recognize healthy dynamics later on, not because they lack intelligence or awareness, but because their internal reference point was shaped in a space where instability was normal. What feels familiar is not always what is healthy. and what is healthy can feel unfamiliar, distant, or even uncomfortable. The complexity lies in the fact that this wound doesn't only carry pain, it also carries adaptation. The same mind that learned to survive in an unstable environment becomes highly perceptive, emotionally attuned, and capable of reading subtle dynamics that others might completely miss. But without awareness, these abilities remain tied to survival rather than transformation. And this is where the deeper truth begins to unfold, because the wound is not just something that needs to be healed, it is something that must first be understood. As this invisible wound continues to shape the psyche, something even more decisive begins to develop, something that determines whether the experience of trauma will become a source of inner strength or a pattern of ongoing suffering. What most people fail to realize is that trauma itself does not automatically create resilience, it creates intensity. And that intensity can move in different directions depending on how it is processed within the mind. There is a point where the psyche begins to organize itself around what it has experienced, forming internal strategies to cope with emotional instability, and these strategies often operate unconsciously. Some individuals begin to internalize the chaos, turning it inward through self-doubt, anxiety, or a constant sense of inadequacy, while others begin to observe it, creating a form of psychological distance that allows them to understand patterns rather than be consumed by them. According to Carl Jung, the human psyche contains both the potential for fragmentation and the potential for integration, and what determines the outcome is not the absence of pain, but the relationship one develops with it. When pain is denied or suppressed, it tends to manifest in distorted ways, influencing behavior, relationships, and identity without conscious awareness. However, when pain begins to be observed, questioned, and gradually understood, it can transform into a source of insight and inner structure. This is where the distinction becomes critical, because two people can go through similar environments and emerge in completely different ways, not because one suffered more or less, but because one remained identified with the wound, while the other began, even unconsciously, to separate from it and reflect on it. That reflection, even if incomplete at first, is what initiates the process of transformation. The same sensitivity that once served as a survival mechanism can evolve into emotional intelligence. The same awareness of tension can become the ability to read complex human dynamics. And the same internal struggle can become a drive for self-understanding that goes far beyond surface-level existence. But this transformation is not automatic, and it is not comfortable, because it requires confronting what was once avoided. So the real question is not whether trauma creates strength, but whether that pain is being lived unconsciously or transformed consciously. As time passes, what was once a response to survive does not simply disappear. It evolves into something far more complex. Something that Carl Jung described as the shadow, the part of the psyche that carries everything we were forced to suppress, deny, or adapt to in order to function within our environment. And when someone grows up in a toxic family dynamic, this shadow is not small or occasional. It becomes deeply structured, influencing thoughts, reactions, and relationships in ways that often go unnoticed. This is where many people begin to feel something they cannot fully explain. a recurring pattern in their adult life where certain situations repeat, where the same emotional dynamics reappear in different forms, and where relationships seem to trigger familiar discomfort, even when the circumstances are different. It is not coincidence, and it is not simply bad luck. It is the unconscious attempting to recreate unresolved patterns in an effort to bring them into awareness. The difficulty is that the shadow does not present itself clearly. It disguises itself as personality, as preference, as instinct, making it difficult to distinguish between who you are and what you adapted to become. You may find yourself reacting more intensely than the situation requires, feeling drawn to familiar emotional dynamics even when they are unhealthy, or repeating behaviors that you consciously know do not serve you, yet feel strangely automatic. According to Jung, what is not made conscious will be lived as fate, meaning that without awareness, these internal patterns begin to shape external reality in a way that feels inevitable. It can feel as though life keeps presenting the same challenges, the same types of people, the same emotional cycles, not because you are choosing them deliberately, but because something within you is still operating from an unresolved structure formed long ago. What makes this stage so important is that it represents a turning point, because the moment you begin to notice these patterns, even without fully understanding them, you are no longer completely controlled by them. Awareness does not eliminate the shadow instantly, but it begins to separate you from it, creating space between reaction and understanding. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Not the absence of pain, but the possibility of no longer being unconsciously driven by it. There comes a moment, and it does not arrive loudly or dramatically, where everything you have carried begins to feel different. Not because the past has changed, but because your relationship with it starts to shift in a way that is almost imperceptible at first, yet deeply transformative over time. This is the point most people never fully reach, because it requires something far more difficult than enduring pain. It requires facing it without identifying with it. Up until this stage, the trauma has functioned as a structure, something that shaped your reactions, your identity, and the way you interpreted the world, often without your awareness. But here, something begins to separate.
Not the experience from your history, but your sense of self from the meaning you once attached to it. And this is where the transformation begins, not in what happened, but in how it is integrated within you. According to Carl Jung, true psychological growth occurs through a process he called individuation, where the individual begins to integrate the unconscious aspects of the psyche rather than being controlled by them. This does not mean eliminating pain or erasing the past, but understanding it deeply enough that it no longer defines the boundaries of who you are. What once felt like a limitation begins to reveal itself as a source of perception, because the same sensitivity that once made you vulnerable now allows you to see with clarity. The same awareness that once kept you in survival mode now becomes the foundation for understanding yourself and others on a deeper level. And the same internal conflict that once created instability now becomes the material through which you build coherence. This is why strong individuals are not those who avoided pain, but those who learned to transform it without denying it, who allowed themselves to see what was uncomfortable, to question what was internalized, and to gradually reconstruct their identity in a way that is no longer dictated by what they endured. And this is the truth that is rarely spoken, because it is not easy to accept, that the very environment that wounded you may also have been the place where the raw material of your strength was formed, not as something complete, but as something that required awareness, time, and conscious integration to become what it was capable of being. At this point, the past no longer disappears, but it also no longer imprisons you, because it has been transformed from something that controls you into something you understand. And that understanding is what creates freedom, not from what happened,
but from the unconscious patterns that once shaped your life without your consent. And that is when pain stops being a cycle and becomes a source of power.